Somewhere beneath 40 feet of cold, dark water in northern Michigan, a circle of stones sits on a lake bed that was dry land 10,000 years ago. One of those stones appears to carry a carving, a shape that looks disturbingly like a mastodon, an animal that vanished from this continent around the end of the last ice age. If that image is what it appears to be, then someone stood on that ground, looked at a living mastodon, and recorded it in stone before the meltwater rose and swallowed everything. That is not a fringe claim. That is what the sonar data suggests. And the team that found it was not hunting for mysteries. They were mapping shipwrecks. This is a video about 5 discoveries scattered across North America, from the bottom of a Great Lake to the open desert of California, each one raising a question that no researcher has been able to fully close. These are not rumors. They are not internet legends. They are stones, bones, and carvings that exist in the physical world, that have been photographed, x-rayed, studied, and argued over for decades. And in every case, the argument is still going. Let us start under the water. In the summer of 2007, Mark Hawley, a professor of underwater archaeology at Northwestern Michigan College, was conducting a routine sonar survey of Grand Traverse Bay, a deep, cold arm of Lake Michigan that stretches inland near Traverse City. Hawley's project had nothing to do with ancient civilizations. He was scanning the lake bed for shipwrecks, the kind of work that underwater archaeologists in the Great Lakes region do every season. The lakes swallowed hundreds of vessels over the centuries, and many of them still sit on the bottom, preserved by the frigid fresh water like museum pieces in a vault. But what Hawley's sonar returned that day was not a shipwreck. About 40 feet below the surface, the equipment revealed a line of large stones arranged in a pattern that did not look natural. The stones sat on a relatively flat section of the lake bed, spaced at what appeared to be deliberate intervals, forming a rough alignment that some observers later compared, perhaps too eagerly, to Stonehenge. That comparison stuck. Within weeks of the first media reports, the phrase Lake Michigan Stonehenge was circulating online, and it has never quite gone away. Now, calling it Stonehenge is an overstatement. Nobody found massive trilithons or a henge monument on the floor of Grand Traverse Bay. What Hawley documented was a series of stones, some of them several feet across, sitting in a configuration that appeared too orderly to be the random scattering of glacial debris. In a region shaped by retreating ice sheets, boulders are everywhere, dragged, dropped, and piled by glaciers over thousands of years. The Great Lakes themselves are glacial scars. So the first question any geologist would ask is straightforward. Could this just be a natural moraine feature? An accident of ice and gravity? Hawley did not dismiss that possibility, but one stone caught his attention more than the arrangement itself. On its surface, there appeared to be a carved image, a shape that resembled a mastodon, the large, tusked relative of the elephant that roamed North America until roughly 10 to 11,000 years ago. If that carving is genuine, the implications are significant, because it would mean someone created it while mastodons were still alive, and did so at a time when this section of the lake bed was dry, walkable ground. Lake Michigan's water levels have fluctuated enormously since the end of the last glacial period. Around 10,000 years ago, what is now the bottom of Grand Traverse Bay was a river valley, a landscape of forests and grassland sitting well above the waterline. People could have lived there. People almost certainly did live there. Paleo-Indian populations were present across the Great Lakes region during that era. The idea that they might have arranged stones or carved images is not extraordinary in itself. What makes this find uncomfortable is the specific content of the carving and the location where it was found. Hawley brought in a colleague, Chris Doyle, to help examine the site. Divers visited the stones, photographs were taken, and from those photographs, a quiet academic disagreement began that has never been resolved. Some researchers looked at the image on the stone and saw a plausible mastodon, a body shape, a curving tusk, a domed head consistent with the animal's known anatomy. Others looked at the same image and saw pareidolia, the human brain's tendency to find meaningful patterns in random textures. A crack in the rock, a patch of discoloration, a natural groove. Put them together underwater, in low visibility, and the mind fills in the gaps. This is not a dismissal. Pareidolia is a well-documented phenomenon, and underwater archaeology is especially vulnerable to it, because divers work in poor light, with limited time, and often cannot examine a surface the way they would in a dry lab. The stone has never been removed from the lake bed. It remains in situ, protected by the water above it and by the jurisdictional complexity of underwater heritage sites in the Great Lakes. Michigan law treats submerged archaeological sites seriously, and disturbing them without permits is a criminal offense. That legal protection, while important, also means that the mastodon carving has never been examined under controlled laboratory conditions. No one has run a finger across its grooves under a microscope. No one has done a detailed 3D scan of the surface texture to distinguish tool marks from natural weathering. The evidence remains suggestive but inconclusive, exactly the kind of situation that frustrates everyone involved. What is not in dispute is that the lake bed was once dry, that Paleo-Indian cultures inhabited the region, and that those cultures were capable of symbolic expression. Rock art from the same general time period exists elsewhere in North America. The question is whether this particular stone, on this particular lake bed, carries a genuine artifact of that era, or whether we are staring at a random crack and wanting it to mean something. Mark Hawley himself has remained cautious. He has described the find as intriguing and worthy of further study, but he has never claimed certainty. That restraint, in a field where certainty sells better than caution, is worth noting. And here is the part that does not get mentioned often enough. The Great Lakes are not a single, stable body of water. They are a system that has been draining, refilling, and reshaping itself for more than 10,000 years. Entire landscapes, forests, river valleys, campsites, burial grounds are sitting beneath the water, largely unexplored. Less than 10% of the Great Lakes lakebed has been surveyed with modern sonar. Whatever is down there, the stones in Grand Traverse Bay may be the least of it. But stones on the bottom of a lake are one kind of mystery. A stone monument that appeared in broad daylight, paid for in cash, designed by someone who refused to reveal their name. That is an entirely different kind of puzzle. And for more than 40 years, it stood in a field in rural Georgia, saying things that made people deeply uneasy. On a low hilltop in Elbert County, Georgia, about 90 miles east of Atlanta, a set of granite slabs stood for over 4 decades in a configuration that looked vaguely like a smaller, stranger Stonehenge. They were called the Georgia Guidestones, and unlike most mysterious monuments, these did not come from an ancient civilization. They were erected in March of 1980, commissioned by a man who walked into the offices of a local granite company and placed an order for the most unusual monument the company had ever been asked to build. The man introduced himself as Robert C. Christian. He said the name was a pseudonym. He said he represented a small group of loyal Americans who wished to remain anonymous. He described the monument he wanted: 6 granite slabs, 4 upright panels, a center column, and a capstone, standing over 19 feet tall, inscribed with a set of 10 principles in 8 modern languages. The languages were English, Spanish, Swahili, Hindi, Hebrew, Arabic, traditional Chinese, and Russian. On the capstone, 4 additional messages were inscribed in ancient scripts: Babylonian cuneiform, Classical Greek, Sanskrit, and Egyptian hieroglyphics. The president of Elberton Granite Finishing Company, Joe Fendley, initially thought the stranger was joking. The scale of the request was enormous. The specifications were precise. Astronomical alignments were required so that the monument would function as a calendar, a compass, and a clock. And the man was offering to pay the full cost up front, in cash, through a local bank. Fendley quoted an inflated price, expecting the man to walk away. He did not walk away. The project went forward. The 10 messages carved into the stones read like a set of instructions for rebuilding civilization after a catastrophe. The first principle called for maintaining the world's population below 500 million in perpetual balance with nature. Others advocated for a world court, a new universal language, the balancing of personal rights with social duties, and the avoidance of petty laws and useless officials. The language was measured, almost clinical. It did not reference any religion, political party, or nation. It read like the work of someone who had thought carefully about how human societies collapse and what might prevent it from happening again. And that is exactly what made people uncomfortable. The population guideline, in particular, drew immediate suspicion. 500 million people is roughly 1/16 of the current global population. Critics pointed out that reducing humanity to that number would require the disappearance of more than 7 billion people. And they asked, what kind of mind would carve that instruction into granite and leave it standing in a field? Conspiracy theories accumulated around the guidestones like ivy. Some claimed they were a manifesto for a new world order. Others called them satanic. Evangelical groups protested at the site. Vandals defaced the stones repeatedly over the years, spray-painting slogans and biblical verses onto the granite. But the identity of R.C. Christian was never confirmed. The banker who handled the financial arrangements, Wyatt Martin of Granite City Bank, signed a confidentiality agreement and kept his silence for decades, even under intense pressure from journalists, investigators, and documentary filmmakers. Martin admitted that he knew the man's real name but refused to reveal it, saying he had given his word. In a small southern town where everybody knows everybody, that oath held. What do you think was behind this? Was it a genuine attempt to leave a philosophical message for future generations? A kind of time capsule carved in granite? Or something stranger, more calculated, more unsettling? Write your answer in the comments, because the theories around the guidestones have never converged on a single explanation, and your reading of the evidence is as valid as most of what has been published. Over the years, several investigators tried to unmask the man behind the pseudonym. The most thorough effort came from a documentary filmmaker and later from journalist Randall Sullivan, who published his own research suggesting a possible connection to a doctor from Iowa with interest in population control and eugenics. But none of these investigations produced definitive proof. The trail always went cold at the banker's desk. The guidestones stood in that field for 42 years. Local authorities installed surveillance cameras after repeated vandalism. The monument became a minor tourist attraction, drawing tens of thousands of visitors a year. Some curious, some reverent, some hostile. A time capsule was reportedly buried beneath the site, though no date was ever set for its opening, and it remains unclear whether anything was actually placed in the ground. Then, in the early hours of July 6, 2022, an explosive device detonated against one of the panels, shattering it and damaging the capstone. Surveillance footage captured the blast. Within hours, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation was on site. Later that same day, local authorities made the decision to demolish the remaining stones, citing safety concerns. The rubble was hauled away. The hilltop was cleared. As of now, no one has been publicly charged with the bombing. The investigation, according to the GBI, remains open. And the question of who built the monument, what they truly intended, and why someone decided to destroy it, is now layered on top of itself. A mystery inside a mystery, with the physical evidence reduced to gravel. But at least the guidestones existed in plain sight. The next discovery on our list was pulled out of the mud in a quiet corner of Maine, and it carries inscriptions that, if authentic, could rewrite the timeline of European contact with the Americas. In 1971, a man named Walter Elliott was walking along the shore of Spirit Pond, a small body of water in the town of Phippsburg on the coast of Maine. Elliott was not an archaeologist. He was a local resident, and what he found that day were 3 flat stones, partially buried in the mud near the pond's edge. The stones were small enough to hold in 2 hands, and their surfaces were covered in markings, lines, symbols, and what appeared to be runic inscriptions. Runes are the letters of the alphabets used by Norse and other Germanic peoples from roughly the 2nd century onward. They appear on thousands of artifacts across Scandinavia, from memorial stones in Swedish churchyards to graffiti scratched into the walls of Hagia Sophia by Viking mercenaries. Finding runes in Scandinavia is routine. Finding them in Maine is something else entirely. Elliot brought the stones to the Maine State Museum in Augusta. The museum accepted them for study, and the argument began almost immediately. One of the stones appeared to carry a map. Another bore what some researchers interpreted as a runic text, possibly a narrative. The inscriptions were examined by several runologists, specialists in the study of runic writing systems, and opinions split sharply. Einar Haugen, a prominent Scandinavian linguist at Harvard, examined the stones and concluded they were forgeries, likely modern. Haugen pointed to irregularities in the rune forms, inconsistencies with known medieval Norse writing conventions, and what he considered an implausible mixture of runic characters from different periods and regions. His verdict was blunt. Someone had carved these stones recently, using a basic knowledge of runes and not much else. But not everyone agreed. Other researchers noted that runic writing was never as standardized as Latin script. Regional variations were common. Carvers made mistakes. Informal inscriptions, especially those made far from Scandinavia by travelers or settlers, might look different from the polished memorial stones that filled the textbooks. Suzanne Carlson, an independent researcher who spent years studying the spirit pond stones, argued that the inscriptions were consistent with a late Norse runic tradition and that Haugen's dismissal was premature. She pointed to specific rune forms that, while unusual, had parallels in lesser-known Scandinavian inscriptions. The broader context makes the debate even more tangled. Norse presence in North America is not speculation, it is established fact. The archaeological site at L'Anse aux Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, was confirmed in the 1960s as a genuine Norse settlement dating to around 1000 AD. The sagas describe voyages to a land called Vinland, and the physical evidence at L'Anse aux Meadows matches. So the Norse were here. The question is how far south they traveled, how long they stayed, and whether they left any trace beyond Newfoundland. Maine is not an unreasonable candidate. The coast is dotted with sheltered harbors and navigable rivers. Norse seafarers routinely covered enormous distances in open boats. A voyage from Newfoundland down the coast of Maine would have been well within their capabilities. The problem is not geography. The problem is evidence, specifically the quality of the evidence. The Spirit Pond stones remain in the collection of the Maine State Museum. They have never been definitively authenticated, and they have never been definitively debunked. No scientific dating of the inscriptions themselves has produced a conclusive result, in part because dating a carving on stone is far more difficult than dating organic material. You can radiocarbon date a piece of charcoal or a bone. You cannot radiocarbon date a groove cut into granite. There is one more detail that deserves attention. The stones were found in an area with a long history of hoaxes and dubious archaeological claims. New England, in particular, has a rich tradition of amateur antiquarians finding proof of pre-Columbian European contact, from the Kensington Rune Stone in Minnesota to the Newport Tower in Rhode Island. Some of these claims have been thoroughly discredited. Others remain ambiguous. The Spirit Pond stones sit in that ambiguous zone, neither proven nor disproven, a puzzle that depends almost entirely on how much trust you place in the analysis of a handful of carved lines. If you find yourself drawn into mysteries like this, cases where the evidence exists but the interpretation keeps shifting, subscribe to this channel, because the deeper we go into these stories, the more you realize that the clean, confident version of history we learn in school is built on top of enormous gaps, and those gaps are where the interesting questions live. Now, from inscriptions on stone, we move to something far stranger: a body. A very small body, found deep inside a mountain in Wyoming, sitting upright on a ledge as if it had been placed there deliberately. In June of 1932, two gold prospectors named Cecil Main and Frank Carr were blasting through rock in the San Pedro Mountains, a rugged range in Carbon County, Wyoming. They were looking for gold. What they found behind a wall of stone was a small sealed cavity, a natural alcove hidden inside the mountain with no visible entrance. Sitting on a ledge inside the cavity was a figure. It was a mummy. It was sitting cross-legged, with its arms folded across its lap, its eyes closed and its mouth slightly open. Its skin was dark, leathery, and drawn tight against the bones beneath. The fingernails were visible, the facial features were intact, and it was tiny. The entire figure measured roughly 14 inches from the base of its seated position to the top of its head, about 35 centimeters. Seated, it could have fit comfortably on a dinner plate. Standing, it might have reached a person's knee. Main and Carr brought the mummy out of the mountain. Photographs were taken. Word spread. Within weeks, the little figure, quickly nicknamed Pedro, had become a sensation. It was displayed in sideshows, passed between private collectors, and eventually subjected to the one examination that changed the nature of the conversation entirely. In the 1950s, the mummy was X-rayed by Dr. Harry Shapiro of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. The X-rays revealed something that made the find far harder to dismiss as a curiosity. The skeletal structure inside the mummy appeared to be that of a fully formed adult, not an infant or a fetus. The bones were developed. The skull showed evidence of fontanelle closure, the process by which the soft spots on a baby's skull fuse into solid bone, a process that typically completes in early childhood. The teeth were visible, and some appeared to be adult teeth. One detail from the X-ray was particularly striking. The skull appeared to show evidence of trauma, a compressed or damaged area consistent with a violent blow. If the X-ray interpretation was correct, then Pedro was not a baby who died at birth. Pedro was an extremely small adult, a person who had lived, grown, and died, possibly violently, at a stature far below anything considered normal for a human being. This is where the debate divides into two paths. One interpretation, favored by most modern researchers who have commented on the case, is that Pedro was an infant or fetus who suffered from anencephaly, or another severe congenital condition affecting skeletal development. Anencephaly causes the skull to form abnormally, and in some cases the resulting skeletal appearance can mimic that of a miniature adult. Closed fontanelles, developed-looking bone structure, and proportions that do not match a typical infant. This explanation is medically plausible. It accounts for the small size, the unusual skeletal features, and the general appearance of the mummy without requiring anything outside known human biology. The other interpretation, the one that refuses to go away, is rooted in the oral traditions of several Native American groups in the region. The Shoshone, the Crow, and other peoples of the northern plains and Rocky Mountains have long told stories of the Namaragar, a race of small, aggressive beings said to inhabit the mountains and badlands. The Namaragar were described as tiny people, sometimes hostile, who lived in caves and fought with poisoned arrows. These stories predate European contact and have deep roots in the region's indigenous traditions. When Pedro was discovered, some observers immediately connected the mummy to the Namaragar legends, arguing that the figure was physical evidence of a real population of very small humans, or something else, that once lived in the mountains of Wyoming. The connection is compelling as a narrative, but narrative is not evidence. No population of miniature adults has ever been documented by modern science in North America. The Namaragar stories, like many indigenous oral traditions, may encode real observations in symbolic or mythological form, but mapping legend onto a single mummified body is a leap that most anthropologists are unwilling to make without far more evidence. And here is the most frustrating part of the story. After the X-rays were taken, Pedro passed into private hands again. The mummy was owned for a time by a man named Ivan Goodman, a Casper, Wyoming businessman. When Goodman died in 1950, the mummy's trail went cold. Its current whereabouts are unknown. It may be in a private collection. It may have been lost, discarded, or destroyed. No one has been able to locate it for modern re-examination with the tools available today. CT scanning, DNA analysis, isotopic dating, advanced imaging. The one piece of physical evidence that could potentially settle the argument is gone. A second similar mummy was reportedly found in the same general region in the 1990s, but it too passed into private possession quickly and has not been made available for peer-reviewed study. The pattern is maddening. The finds appear, generate intense interest, and then vanish into the private market before science can get a proper look. What remains is the X-ray, the photographs, and the stories. The Shoshone stories of little people in the mountains, the prospector's account of a sealed cave, and the image of a 14-inch figure sitting cross-legged in the dark, waiting to be found. From a body hidden inside a mountain, we now move to something that cannot be hidden at all, because it is etched into the surface of the earth itself, visible only from the sky and stretching longer than a 15-story building laid on its side. In 1932, the same year Pedro was pulled out of the San Pedro Mountains, a pilot named George Palmer was flying over the Colorado Desert near Blythe, California, close to the Arizona border. From his cockpit, Palmer looked down and saw something that no one on the ground had noticed, something that could not be seen from ground level at all. Enormous figures carved into the desert surface. They are called the Blythe intaglios, and they are among the largest human-made figures on Earth. An intaglio is the opposite of a mound or a relief. Instead of building something up, the creators scraped away the top layer of dark desert pavement, the sun-blackened pebbles and stones that coat the desert floor, to expose the lighter soil beneath. The result is a negative image, a figure drawn in contrast, visible only when seen from above or from a significant distance. Up close, standing on the ground beside them, the figures are nearly impossible to perceive. The lines are subtle, the scale too large for the human eye to assemble at ground level. You need altitude to see what they are. And what they are is striking. The largest figure is a human shape stretching approximately 171 feet, about 52 meters, from head to toe. That is longer than the wingspan of a Boeing 737. Nearby, there are other figures, additional human shapes, a four-legged animal that may represent a horse, a mountain lion, or a mythological creature, and a spiral. The figures are distributed across 3 separate sites on 2 mesa tops overlooking the Colorado River floodplain. In total, there are 6 distinct figures, all created using the same technique of surface removal. The indigenous peoples of the lower Colorado River region, the Mojave, the Quechan, and other human-speaking groups, have oral traditions connected to these figures. Some researchers believe the largest human figure may represent Mastamho, a creator deity in Mojave cosmology who, according to tradition, shaped the landscape along the Colorado River and guided the spirits of the dead. The animal figure has been interpreted as a representation of Hatakulia, a mountain lion associated with creation narratives. These identifications are not universally accepted among scholars, but they suggest that the intaglios were tied to the spiritual geography of the region, not decorative, not practical, but sacred. Dating the intaglios has proven difficult. Because the figures were created by removing surface material rather than by depositing organic matter, there is very little to radiocarbon date. Estimates for their age range widely, from roughly a few hundred years to several thousand years. Some researchers have attempted to date the figures by studying the rate at which desert varnish, the dark coating of manganese and iron oxides that forms on exposed rock surfaces in arid environments, has reaccumulated on the cleared areas. This method is imprecise, but has suggested that some of the figures could be considerably older than initially assumed. The survival of the intaglios is itself remarkable. The Colorado Desert receives less than 3 inches of rainfall per year. Wind erosion is minimal in the area. The desert pavement, once disturbed, does not regenerate quickly. So the figures have persisted, largely unchanged, for centuries, possibly millennia, simply because the environment is too dry and too still to erase them. In a wetter climate, they would have vanished within a generation. But that durability also made them vulnerable to a different threat. After their discovery in 1932, the Blythe intaglios became a curiosity. Visitors drove across them in off-road vehicles. Tracks were cut through the figures. By the time the Bureau of Land Management fenced the sites in 1952, significant damage had already been done to some of the outlines. The fencing helped, but it came 20 years too late for full preservation. One question that researchers have never fully answered is why these figures were made to be seen only from above. The creators did not have aircraft. They could not have seen the completed figures from the perspective that makes them legible. Some scholars have suggested that the figures were not meant for human eyes at all, that they were intended for spiritual beings, for deities looking down from the sky, or for the spirits of the dead ascending after death.
Others have proposed that the figures may have been created incrementally, planned using sightlines from nearby hills or elevated terrain, and that the creators understood the geometry well enough to produce coherent figures without needing to see them from directly overhead. Similar geoglyphs exist elsewhere in the world, the Nazca lines in Peru being the most famous example. But the Blythe intaglios are far less studied, far less visited, and far less protected than their South American counterparts. They sit in an empty stretch of desert along a highway, marked by a small sign and a chain-link fence, visited by a few thousand people a year. Most Americans have never heard of them. And that raises a broader question, one that connects all 5 discoveries we have looked at today. If you are watching this video and learning about some of these for the first time, and statistically for at least 2 or 3 of them, you almost certainly are, then ask yourself why. Not why they are mysterious, but why they are obscure. North America is not supposed to have mysteries like these. The popular version of the continent story is clean and short. Indigenous peoples lived here for thousands of years. Europeans arrived, and the modern era began. The deep past is treated as a blank, a long, quiet stretch of time before written records, before cities, before anything that would require complicated explanation. But the physical evidence keeps suggesting otherwise. Stones arranged on a lake bed that was dry during the last ice age. Runes carved on rocks found in coastal Maine. A 14-inch mummy in a sealed cave in Wyoming. Figures the size of buildings scraped into a desert that has barely changed since they were made. A granite monument built in the 20th century by people who still have not been identified. None of these discoveries require supernatural explanation. None of them demand aliens or lost continents or secret civilizations. What they demand is attention. The kind of slow, patient, well-funded attention that archaeological science can provide when it chooses to. And in most of these cases, that attention has been insufficient, inconsistent, or simply absent. The Michigan stones have never been properly excavated. The Spirit Pond runes have never been conclusively dated. Pedro the mummy is missing. The Blythe intaglios were driven over for 20 years before anyone thought to protect them. The Georgia Guidestones were blown up, demolished, and hauled away, and the investigation has gone quiet. If there is a pattern here, it is not conspiracy. It is neglect. The particular kind of neglect that happens when a discovery does not fit neatly into the story we have already decided to tell. And if this is the kind of mystery that stays with you after the video ends, the kind where the real discomfort is not what we found, but what we failed to look at closely enough, share it with someone who thinks the same way. Because these places, these objects, these questions, they do not disappear just because we stop paying attention. They sit there, under the water, in the desert, inside the mountain, waiting for someone to come back and finish the work. The stones are still on the bottom of Lake Michigan. The runes are still in a drawer at the Maine State Museum. The desert figures are still staring up at a sky that no living person carved them to face. And somewhere, in a private collection or a forgotten storage room, a tiny mummy may still be sitting cross-legged in the dark, with its arms folded and its mouth slightly open, holding an answer that no one has bothered to come looking for.